The Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana proudly presents its annual Black History Month event virtually this year in partnership with the Historic New Orleans Collection. The Historic New Orleans Collection's monumental Oscar Dunn and His Radical Fight in Reconstruction Louisiana reveals in graphic novel format the incredible life story of Louisiana's and America's first black lieutenant governor and acting governor. Oscar Dunn was a stalwart champion of universal male suffrage, civil rights, and integrated public schools, and was praised by friends and rivals for his integrity. Dunn died while in office, and his story faded from memory until now. Monumental, the first book-length account of Dunn, is the culmination of decades of research by one of Dunn's own descendants, author Brian K. Mitchell, who, with illustrator Barrington S. Edwards and editor Nick Weldon, brings to light an essential piece of American history buried for far too long. In a starred review, Kirkus called Monumental an exemplary graphic work built on a foundation of impressive scholarship. Author Brian K. Mitchell is an assistant professor of history at the University of Arkansas Little Rock and an associate faculty member at the Anderson Institute on Race and Ethnicity. A New Orleans native, Mitchell received a Ph.D. in urban studies with a concentration in public history at the University of New Orleans. Mitchell's writing and research primarily deals with race, violence, and the Elaine Massacre, and has been featured by CNN, NPR, and the Associated Press. Nick Weldon is an associate editor at the Historic New Orleans Collection, where he edited Enigmatic Stream, Industrial Landscapes of the Lower Mississippi River by Richard Sexton in 2019, and materials for several major exhibitions. He was previously senior editor at Runner's World and has written about a wide range of topics for other outlets. We are honored to present our 2021 Black History Month program featuring a conversation between Brian and Nick.
Hey everybody, my name is Nick Weldon. I'm the editor of Monumental, Oscar Dunn and His Radical Fight in Reconstruction Louisiana, which the Historic New Orleans Collection will be publishing March 5th. And I'm really excited that the Louisiana Center for Book has invited me and Brian Mitchell, the author of Monumental, for a conversation today. Hey Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you, Nick.
It's good to see you too. We've been working on this book. You've been working on this book for well over 10 years. And, I came into it around 2017 and, it's a long time coming to get to this point. And, something I wanted to do with the audience today was just share some of the backstory for how this book came into being, because, in my mind, having experienced this book as the editor, your story, Brian, and your background with how you came to make this book is just as fascinating as the book itself, which we should say is a graphic novel. It's a graphic history about the life of Oscar Dunn, who was America's first Black lieutenant governor and acting governor from right here in Louisiana during Reconstruction. And Brian, he's your ancestor. And I wanted to start by asking you, when was the first time you learned about Oscar Dunn and your relation to him? How old were you? Where were you at the time? Maybe we can go back to there, your first encounter with Oscar Dunn.
In the second grade, my mother decided to send me to Louisiana. It was her final year of nursing school. She was going through a divorce. And I came back to stay with family members. My grandmother.
And where were you?
How old was I?
No, where were you?
I was in Chicago at the time. And my grandmother lived a few blocks away from the school. So I could walk to school, and then after school, go and sit with her, and until my aunt could come and pick me up. So I would do that every day. And as you can imagine, you get a little bored at your grandmother's house in the afternoons. And so I'd sit around and just read magazines that were sitting there, because she had tons and tons of magazines and photo albums, and ask her about pictures. And that was the sort of thing that I did every day that year until my mother came back to Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. And so you're looking at albums. Are you saying newspaper clips? When did you find out about Oscar Dunn?
Well, I was going through one of the sort of a scrapbook, and
Mhm.
there were photographs. There were photographs of her family members, her children, and there was a newspaper clipping about Oscar Dunn. And what I immediately noticed is that is Dunn's last name was the same as my grandmother's or my great grandmother's. And
Mhm.
she pointed out, oh, well, he was related to your grandfather uh, when he was alive. And I said, well, oh my goodness, tell me about him. So
Yeah.
she told me, she began telling me stories. So every day I'd come home and ask her something else about him. And
Mhm.
she, tell me these stories. And at the time I was just a kid. So
Yeah.
assume, all right, maybe she's telling me these stories just to get rid of you. But and later on, you'll find as I got older and I got more curious, particularly in college and graduate school, I wanted to see how closely her stories meshed with the actual Dunn figure. And
Mhm.
it's like, okay, were these just all fanciful like stories, or
Uh-huh.
were they real? And a lot
Yeah.
of them turned out to be very real. Others, I don't know if I'll be able to confirm for years, but the ones that are included in the book, are a lot of them are stories that match with what she had laid out
Wow.
for me at 8 years old.
And at 8 years old, you find out that this is a family member who did all these incredible things, was the lieutenant governor of Louisiana. How did that make you feel? I mean, just to know that you had this connection to this person.
Well, at 8, it really, at that moment when she expressed it to me, it didn't have a significance. And the significance was gained really when I went back to school about a week
Mhm.
later. And we were talking about the government and how government was organized and who the current lieutenant governor was and governor, and how the legislature was organized. And the teacher asked, could anybody else identify another governor or lieutenant governor? And I said, sure. And I said, Oscar Dunn. And she said, well, I've never heard of Oscar Dunn. And I said, well, he was the first Black lieutenant governor of the state. And she said, that's not true. There's never been a Black lieutenant governor of the state. So even my teacher at that level did not,
Wow.
she had never heard anything of Dunn at that point.
Wow. And how, I mean, hearing this from your teacher who, you're a kid and you're inclined to trust what the teacher tells you. And here you've been told that this thing that your great grandmother has told you about your family, she's refuting this, your teacher is. And how did you feel? What did you do after, you got that news
Well,
from your teacher?
your secondary peers are going to laugh when the teacher says that. So I was a little embarrassed, and I went back and told my grandmother, and she's like, no, that's not true. It's very much true. And, she went back and showed me the article again. And she's like, no, it actually happened. People just don't remember it anymore. And this notion of memory and what's remembered and what's taught um, began to resonate with me at a very, very early age, that there's some parts of history that might be ignored.
Yeah. Now, that school year, was this done thing? Did you bring it up again, or did you kind of bury it? Like, how did things go after that? I'm curious.
Well, I sort of buried it for years. Not that
Yeah.
I didn't, I just didn't bring it up in class, and I didn't talk about it very much. And it really wasn't until the 90s that it became a real visible force in my life. And that's because of the internet and digital sources. So by that point in time, I was in graduate school. I was reading lots of books. There was only a scant amount of information about him. I'd taken two wonderful teachers at the University of New Orleans who both were able to share more about Dunn with me. The late Dr. Joe Louis Caldwell and Dr. Raphael Casimir, who were both exceptional African Americanists, and they shared what they knew about him, and they both encouraged me to fill in those gaps that were in the historical record and to share the stories that I had from my grandmother. Go out and confirm them, figure out if you can find information that proves that these things happen. And they both thought it might be an excellent topic for a dissertation later on. They were both apprehensive about what material would be out there and whether I would be able to find the material. But I decided to give it a shot.
Yeah, and we're all grateful that you did. I'm curious if this was, at what point did this go from you having interest in family history to you taking an interest in this just as history, as US history, as Louisiana history? You know, when, you know, you're a professor now, at what point did the idea kind of spark in your head that you would be interested in history and teaching and education and all of this as a career, as a vocation?
I knew I wanted to do history as a career my entire life, believe it or not. Like I said, my mother was in school when I was younger, and we would go to reading rooms in Chicago, and all the museums had reading rooms, and the scholars would go and read, or students would go and read. And I was a little kid. I was like 6 years old. I'd take tours of all the museums. I would go on tours as a little kid. And I loved it. And I always assumed I'd be an Egyptologist, but I always knew I would be doing something in history. By the time I finished my bachelor degree, I decided to go out and work in the corporate world. And I really missed history. I missed the idea of studying. I missed books. So I decided to go back to graduate school. And at graduate school, I studied history. And then I went ahead and decided to do the PhD. And it was that topic that drew me back, you know, those old stories that my grandmother had written all came back, and I said, well, let me start writing these things down and seeing how much of this I can prove.
Wow. And so you were in second grade, so you kind of learned about your ancestor. This was about the 70s, you know, early mid 70s. At what point do you start, I don't know if you can put a date on it, but when did you really start to dig into it, like as an academic, as a researcher?
Late 89, 90.
Wow.
Yeah, so 89, 90, between 89 and 92 is when I really started reading all the existing journal articles between those years, actively going and looking for information about Dunn and our other archives. And like I said, because this is pretty much all primary research, it takes a long time. It takes a really long time. You have to go, at that point, you really had to physically travel places or do interlibrary loans.
Sure. And so, you know, for the viewers who don't know this, Oscar Dunn passed away while he was in office very unexpectedly. It was 1871. He was lieutenant governor of the state. And so very little for a long time was really known about his record in office. And I'm curious, Brian, what some of the things that you uncovered, what were some of the most surprising things that you found in your, you know, primary source research early on that you were like, oh my goodness, I never knew this before, or this, you know, confirms a story, but where you started to think, wow, this story has some legs?
Okay, there were two big elements that showed me that the story that my grandmother was telling matched up to the historical record. And the first was a story of who Dunn was and where he had lived and who had owned him previously. She'd always said, no, he was born in the city, he was born in the French Quarter, and that he lived there until his stepfather, who was a free man of color, James Dunn, fell in love with his mother and purchased he and his mother out of bondage along with his infant sister. Up until that point, most of the records that existed focused on him being released by James Dunn. No one, up until I started doing research, knew exactly who owned Oscar Dunn prior to, and she had always told me that it was a merchant that lived in the French Quarter, and I was able to put that together. Another area where sort of the grandmother stories came into play were a period of time where Dunn isn't famous, and the notion of him being at school and him being a boarder with the lady who would eventually become his wife, Ellen Boyd, at that time, Marshall. Lots of people maintain that, oh, he met her after the war, but my grandmother had always conceded, no, he lived with her and her husband, which was very controversial at the time, as a boarder, and ended up marrying her after the husband died, which most people, she said, would have been salacious at the time.
And this was before Dunn was in office. And I think that a big gap in the record prior to some of the work that you did was, what was Dunn's life before he became part of the New Orleans City Council, before he campaigned as lieutenant governor? And so what you're saying here is that you found primary sources that really shed a lot of light on his early life, from being born enslaved, and as you said, his stepfather emancipates him, and so you've learned these details of him as a child and as a young adult, and so would you say that that was kind of where you started to piece this biography together, and not just a summary of a time in office, but a life?
Exactly. And that actually gave me a little bit of momentum there, because I said, if I can find this stuff out, what else is there that hasn't really been looked at? And it's during this period of time that digital humanities began to take off, particularly digital resources for genealogy. So for the first time, a lot of newspapers are hitting the web, and you can buy licenses and sort of review them. And this made it affordable for me to do a lot of research that would have required me to fly all over the country. So timing, once again, was crucial. And it's this advent of digital humanities and the access of digital archives online, even though you can pay for them, that made it a lot of this possible.
Now, what do you think kept so much of this information from public understanding for so long?
There are really two ways of looking at it. And first you have to look at what was overtly done, and then you have to think about what people desire to know later on. If his information and his history were overtly suppressed, then subsequent generations of teachers or scholars would not have known of him. Therefore, there wouldn't have been a desire or drive to go research him. If the historic record was altered to make him appear to be just a periphery figure instead of a central figure, then a lot of historians may have overlooked him and said, well, he's not worth studying. He's just a periphery character in a much larger play or much larger scenario that's playing out.
Right. And this book and this research shows just how central he was in all of these fights for suffrage and for civil rights and public school integration, and the feud with Governor Wormuth. But before we kind of dive too deep into those details, I'm curious, when did you finish your dissertation and how long did it take to put all of your research together?
I finished the first draft in 2006. However,
Wow.
you have to remember 2005 was Hurricane Katrina. And it's during that time that the chair, I had a number of chairs on my dissertation who fell ill. So it's during that time that Dr. Caldwell will pass away, and he'll have to be replaced on the chair as a chair. And that sort of the archives being closed in Louisiana and records potentially have being damaged was also a huge sort of setback that slowed it down. So it wasn't until 2011 that the
Wow.
dissertation could be completed and awarded.
Wow. It just seems like in every way, this book shouldn't have happened. You know, there were so many obstacles in the archives and to the record of Dunn himself. And then you could have in second grade decided, I'm never going to look at this stuff again. I'm being told that these are stories, that this is not real history. And that didn't stop you. You get to the point where, you know, you're focusing your academic research on Oscar Dunn. And like you said, Hurricane Katrina happens and you are losing some of your mentors who are helping you with the dissertation. And yet you get it done and you finally have this dissertation in 2011. And so when did you start thinking that you might want to get this work published?
I always wanted to get it published. It wasn't timely. It wasn't an issue that I thought people wanted to hear about. There was a lot of discussion of post-racialism, about that time and shortly thereafter. And there wasn't a lot of interest in Reconstruction until President Barack Obama comes around. And, people start comparing President Barack Obama's administration and the resistance to a lot of the reforms he wanted to make to those same problems that were going on in Reconstruction. And it's at that point that I began to see the timeliness of the book and began exploring the concept of maybe making an academic text of it. The University of New Orleans, keeps an online digital dashboard that allows people to access dissertations and allows, more importantly, authors to track who's reading, their geographic locations of where the downloads take place. And it's
I remember seeing a map.
Yeah,
you shared with me years and years ago.
it was about, I guess, 2015, 16 that I received an email, and by that point I'm teaching. I've got a teaching post. I receive an email, and the email is from, surprisingly, a middle schooler.
Wow.
And he says, "Look, I live in Ohio, and we just got finished reading your dissertation, and we thought it was fantastic." You're like, wait a second, why am I writing you my dissertation to read? And why would you think it was fantastic? So I decided, he put his number on, and he and his father, I called he and his father, they both praised it. And I tested him to see if he really read it, asked him some questions, and, he replied. And I said, "So you really liked it?" And he said, "Yeah." He's like, "Everyone in the class thought it was great." And I asked the question, I said, "How would you improve it?" I mean, I was enthralled that younger audiences were actually enjoying this. So I said, "Okay, how would you make it better for kids that are your age or a little bit older?" And he said, I like comic books. And he said, I read a lot of comic books. He said, it would be nice if it were like a graphic novel. And I said, really? And it's at that point that the idea of making a graphic history sort of struck me.
Yeah, well, that leads into what I wanted to ask about, which is the format of the book, which it is not a traditional academic biography at all. It's a graphic novel. You can kind of see it over my shoulder. The illustration here from Barrington Edwards. Were you interested in comics as a kid? I mean, is this, you know, a format that you have some familiarity even before this student said something to you?
Yeah, I think people would before the concept of blurred black nerd existed. I was there. I was a kid, but I was, you know, the captain of the chess team and the science club, and I really enjoyed reading a lot, and I went to the library all the time. And then when I discovered comics, about 8 years old, 9 years old, I mean, it brought me into a new world. In fact, like my first unofficial job was working at BSI Comics. You know, I go help unload the box and shelve stuff and price stuff and put it in bags. And Mr. Carl, rest his soul, was the owner, and he was always nice and always trying to teach young kids about comics and get pique their interest in comics. So I'd always loved comic books. The idea of me making anything that was graphic, however, was beyond me. I didn't possess the artistic skills. I didn't know very much about the panels and design, and that's where you came in. And
well, not quite.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, you know, when we first started talking about this, you had told me that you had pitched it as a graphic novel before because there was interest in this story, but you were having trouble selling people on the idea of it as a graphic novel, right?
Actually, I pitched it. The first press I pitched it to was Oxford. And Oxford was like really excited about it. The first gentleman, he was over North American acquisitions, and I guess fortunately for us, he left the job. He left the job, and the guy who took over was not interested in doing any North American.
Thank you.
Yeah, doing any North American graphics at that point, and so that sort of left me sort of high and dry with the project, and that led us to the NPR podcast, and that's what really renewed my interest and I guess the nation's interest in Oscar Dolan.
Sure. And for viewers who are not familiar, there was a podcast here in New Orleans called Tripod, hosted by Lane Kaplan Levinson, that was a really great show timed for the city's tricentennial that dove into interesting history that had been overlooked, and the Historic New Orleans Collection worked with the show, and they were looking for a subject around the time of the monuments controversy. And I had just gotten familiar with Brian's research, and we, spoke with Lane and thought, this might be a really good topic for a show. And it ended up, being re-aired nationally, and it really got a lot of attention to Oscar Dunn's story. And that was right when, we decided to engage in a conversation about making this book. And, so many people are excited that this is the path you wanted, and that you really insisted on making a graphic format. And this topic of Reconstruction, it's a complicated history, made more complicated by the obfuscation of facts and narratives over the years. But was it intentional, on your end, to use this format to make really rigorous research more accessible to kids? It seems like maybe because of your experience as a child, like this was not something that you just wanted adults to encounter.
Well, I was first influenced in regard to graphic histories by one of my former professors, who if there is a godfather of graphic history, it is Trevor Getz. He's teaching in San Francisco. And he did really the first graphic history to be widely accepted by historians as something that could be used in the academic setting. And he had always encouraged it. He began encouraging a number of young historians to go out there and try to retell these stories in graphic formats. And I pitched that idea to him, and he was the person that sent me to Oxford because that was a press that he had dealt with.
And this is Albina and the Important Men, is Trevor's book you're referencing. Yeah.
Right. And Albina was a fantastic book, and it did really, really well for the press. But you have to remember that's the international press. He's an Africanist, and he writes things that transpire in Africa. There's an entirely different editor for North America, and they weren't on the same page. The African editor was a bit more avant-garde than the traditionalists that were working in. But now they seem to have shifted. I mean, I noticed that lately they've been trying to put out some North American graphic.
Well, and not just them. It just more and more there are these graphic histories that tackle, important eras from American history or world history, and it's kind of a flourishing, type of publishing right now. And I'm so glad that we were able to make this book. And part of that process was, after we had you under contract and we were brainstorming how to turn your research into something visual, we started building a reference database of images and sourcing for our eventual illustrator to take on, so that our images, I know speaking for the museum and as the editor, it was very important that the images we showed were just as rigorously researched as the work that you had put together. And so when we got Barrington Edwards on board, who is a fabulous illustrator, he's from Boston. He came highly recommended to us by the bestseller John Jennings, and I'm so glad John put us in touch. And we really, made sure that Barrington had the resources so that his portrayals of Oscar Dunn and Governor Warmoth and the Mechanics Institute massacre and some of these major moments from this era that that we were using primary sources to inform that artwork. And I'm curious, how do you feel Barrington's artwork comported with your vision of this story?
Barrington's artwork is absolutely beautiful. There's some, like, my favorites are a lot of the street scenes and night scenes. They are absolutely gorgeous. And I think that they meld really well with the story that's being told. There's a fluid feeling to his art that sort of makes you feel like you're there and wraps. It makes you feel warm inside, and it's beautiful. I mean, absolutely gorgeous work being done. What is very different between, and people have asked me this, what sort of audience is it for? Is it for, middle schoolers? Is it for high schoolers? Is it for college students? Is it for scholars? And we tried to create something that was broad-based, something that could be used by advanced middle schoolers that might be in a gifted program or GT, and used in high school and used in college. It was probably one of my favorite things, or things that I'm most happy about, have been some of the reviews, the early reviews that came back on the book. When you try something that's different, you don't know how it's going to be received. And when those early reviews started coming in, a lot of the people who were reviewing were heroes of mine. Not like, okay, I know this scholar, but like that you read their books as a kid, or read their books as a young,
Yeah.
student, and you admired them. So when all of these raving reviews came back, and very good reviews came back, um, I was strongly encouraged that we were doing the right thing and moving in the
Yeah.
right direction. And I've been very, very excited about it. I'd love to go talk about the book. And none of this could have been possible without you, because I mean, you were the glue that brought the artist, the scholar together, and you were the person that sort of translated the language between the two of us, and made it something that seamlessly fit together and flowed.
Well, it takes, your work on this has moved me so much, and your story, you know, I, I can't help but be passionate about this project because I just know the work that you've put in, and I know the gaps that this book is filling. And, personally, I'm just, I'm very moved to tell stories that have not been told before and to correct the record. And this book just does so much of that. And it's your personal narrative, and it's the story of Oscar Dunn, who really was this towering figure in Reconstruction in Louisiana, whose life was cut short, whose legacy was cut short. And we're just trying to restore the facts of history with this. And that kind of brings me to something else, maybe not as exciting, that I wanted to get, pick your brain about, which is, we're starting to see in some states legislation, and you're teaching in Little Rock right now, to censor US history. And some of, frankly, what I think monumental is the kind of work that ultimately is being targeted by legislatures in Arkansas and Iowa who, don't want to teach the ugly sides of our history. And I think that, frankly, that's what gets us into the trouble we're in now, is when people aren't able to learn the facts of what's happened, and so they cannot correct the mistakes we've made. I mean, how do you feel about that? And do you feel like Monumental is going to be in the crosshairs?
I have been extremely vocal in Arkansas about the two acts that have come before the legislature: one to suppress and stop the teaching of 1619, and the other to end sort of ethnic studies or diverse studies. I think it pushes us way back. Arkansas was seldom at the top of the list for great things, and often on the top of the list for bad ones. This is just another list that the legislature has pushed itself on top of, and it really didn't have to. We talk a lot about our nation being polarized, but we aren't willing to look at why we're polarized or how we got there. And a book like Monumental offers us a chance to take a glance backward, and offers us to say, and this is important, that we make these sort of analysis in our head when we read history, particularly diverse histories. What would have happened had we not, had we not suppressed this? What would have happened had we embraced this notion, some of these ideals that Dunn was espousing at the time in regard to how to unify our nation? And what the conclusion that I come to, and the conclusion that my students come to, is the nation would have been a better place had we just embraced these very plain truths that these figures were presenting at the time. Mm-hmm. We have to also ask ourselves, why are politicians today trying to divide us? There's a certain economy in it. There is a certain power that comes from dividing, especially in a state where populations are diversely in one ethnic group. Mm-hmm. You can retain power for much, much longer because the issues are not cease to be important. What becomes important is race. Stories like Dunn teach us that good people and leadership can come in any color of the rainbow, and anybody who's willing to not be self-serving, anybody that's willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of a state or country can become a leader that is worthy of praise over the years. And we have to also ask ourselves why we suppress this information. You know, why was it important that people not know who Dunn was and what he accomplished?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're really bringing it home here. You know, you look at Dunn's story, and the thing that stands out to me about him is that his contemporaries on both sides of the political aisle, white, black, everybody spoke so highly of him, and he led with character and integrity at a time when many of his peers really did not lead with, you know, morality. You know, a lot of people were in it for personal profit, and something about Dunn, even though he was a stalwart about, you know, racial progress, and, you know, his children, when they integrated schools and by court order in January 1871, his children were in that number. Like he led by example and was praised for it by even his rivals. And I think there's a lot that we can learn about, you know, leading with integrity and standing by your convictions and not capitulating, and which was not something that Oscar Dunn did. And, you know, ultimately maybe that is why he paid the price, you know, why he was forgotten. And that's a real shame. And I hope that we can restore that story. And, you know, I think that it's something that you talk about so well in the historiography chapter of the book, where you know, you make the parallels between 2009 and the Reconstruction era, and the kind of leadership that Dunn modeled. And, you know, so maybe to wrap things up, what are you hoping can be the impact with this book? Is it just about Dunn, or is it about being a part of a bigger conversation here?
Well, I think that the conversation is already beginning to take place. And I think that it's critical to have these sort of resources in the hands of teachers. One of the things that I realized, and I asked my incoming freshmen this all the time, as what was your favorite class in high school? And most of them don't say history. And I ask if they cover a lot of the topics that we cover in class, and most of them say no. This is for the first time in my life I'm hearing about Reconstruction, and it's making me understand where we are today. I think that one of the disadvantages that our nation has is the replication of sort of false histories and the teaching of so-called patriotic histories in place of what actually happened. I believe that a resource like this in the hands of teachers could help at a very early age to sort of sway this tendency to go toward radicalism and clarify what happened in the past in such a manner that people can embrace not just a national narrative, but a narrative that's very inclusive and very diverse.
Yeah. I think that is a perfect way to end this conversation. And I'll just remind everybody that Monumental launches on March 5th, published by the Historic New Orleans Collection, authored by Brian. I was the editor, Barrington was the illustrator. And we really want to thank the State Library of Louisiana for letting us come and speak about this book, but just, you know, this important history. And yeah, you know, Brian, it's really great to chat with you again. Hopefully before long, we'll be able to do this in person. This has been, you know, and that's the other aspect of this, is we were putting the finishing touches on this book in 3 different cities on lockdown. And that was, I can't believe we're actually here getting to talk about a finished product. And I'm so excited to be able to do that and have that opportunity.
Boston, New Orleans, and Little Rock seem very far away from each other when you're having to send work back and forth and wait for stuff to come back and do feedback. So that was a unique experience in itself, writing and putting a book together like this that requires so much interaction during the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, my passion for this book kept me sane. So anyway, I'm glad we're here. So that's really all I have for you for this conversation. But I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
The monumental team of Mitchell, Edwards, and Weldon will join an exciting slate of speakers at the Historic New Orleans Collection's 25th Williams Research Center Symposium, titled Recovered Voices, Black Activism in New Orleans from Reconstruction to the Present Day, March 5th through the 7th. Learn more at hnoc.org.